Welcome back to the Gut Show, Season 3. In this season, we are going to explore gut health and digestion from other perspectives. So in seasons 1 and 2, you mostly heard from me, your host, Erin Judge, dietitian and GI expert. But in season 3, I want to bring in other experts to talk about maybe some other conditions or just other things to think about when we're looking at digestion and digestive disorders. I also want to bring in those who are living with chronic illness, whether that be IBS, IBD, or other conditions, and they've done something from it from a place of advocacy or maybe even providing resources for others in this space. I hope that you enjoy everything that's coming from this season. And while maybe every single topic and interview doesn't completely relate to you and your specific situation, I encourage you to dive into the episodes week by week and learn with me on these different perspectives that experts and some of our peers have to share with us. So dive into episode 1, where we're going to talk to Chelsea Connors all about navigating stress management and self-care. And then meet me back here every single week for a new perspective, a new voice, and me, your host, Erin. Welcome back to the Gut Show. Today's episode is one I'm so excited about because we have one of my favorite experts in the mental health space, Chelsea Connors. She is a certified life coach and a former therapist who's bridging the gap between mental wellness and personal development. She does work with clients individually, hosts group programs, and runs a monthly membership that will be relaunching in February 2022, which is so exciting because we're right on the cusp of that. If you remember from season 2 of The Gut Show, we actually interviewed Chelsea, and you can find that episode as a bonus episode on May 21st. And we talked all about navigating stress and overwhelm. And you can also get to know Chelsea a little bit better there. But as we segue into today's episode and our interview today and our topic that we'll talk about, Chelsea, I would love for you to just say what you've been up to and what's new and what work looks like for you now, maybe some things that you're excited about for the new year.
Yeah, absolutely. So first off, thank you so much for having me back. I'm so excited to be here. And yeah, I think things that I've been working on currently are restructuring some of my individual programming. Like you mentioned in that intro, I'm going to be relaunching my membership called the Practice Vault in February. So I've been doing a lot of work on that. And then I am also collaborating with a team working on developing a coaching program that I can't share a lot of details about just yet, but that is in the works. So a lot of different projects and moving parts over here.
That's exciting. That's so exciting. And I know that many from our community have been kind of overlapping with your community and have loved seeing that. And especially your desire to help those within the chronic illness space, like even if that's not direct. I mean, I feel like there's such a good overlap, especially those with IBS. And so we love seeing that connection, which brings us right into our topic for today and like what we want to start talking about. And that's this idea of being overwhelmed, feeling exhausted, feeling stressed, with chronic illness, with life, we feel that way. So it's like there's already this bar of life, and even recording this episode in early 2022, the past 2 years, like we all collectively feel that bar of just overwhelm has increased. And then those with a chronic illness or digestive disorders, I feel like that bar is even higher, and there's just so much stress and exhaustion that's tied to it, which can be due to the effect that their condition is having on their daily life, which is causing maybe less capacity there, but also navigating their condition and just all the pieces involved with that. And one thing I'd love to get some insight in from you is, what do those types of feelings, the feelings that are associated with that, what kind of when do those actually have a strong impact on the body? And what does that look like?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So I think that they tend to have the strongest impact on the body when they start triggering the release of hormones over and over and over again, right? So cortisol, we know, is a huge stress hormone. So if you're somebody who's very susceptible to feeling stressed or don't have great stress management, tools in your toolbox that can be really, really impactful on how your body begins to feel and how it reacts and learns to respond to life. And then also, if you're starting to experience certain emotions over and over and over again, you're creating different patterns in how you respond to those different emotions. And so sometimes when we're not necessarily slowing down enough to be intentional with what you want that response to look like, we can, and this happens to all of us as human beings, but especially if you're also struggling with chronic illness of some sort, right? We can develop some unhelpful coping mechanisms, patterns, ways of responding that then just take some time and effort to unlearn and find things that are more helpful. And that certainly is a process that I know we both work on with our clients in different ways, but is so impactful for how somebody feels both physically and mentally.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think kind of thinking about that as a visual, it's like there's your capacity to start with, like what you have capacity for, which is going to look different every day, right? Because you might have more filling up that cup, which you don't want to be overfilled with stress or overwhelm or thoughts or whatever. Hormones can affect that. Just, those with the menstrual cycle, those changes, we know that can impact it. Just how you feel when you wake up, if you have symptoms when you wake up or not, or maybe your body's been taxed. So that capacity cup can be very different. But then there's also almost these triggers, which may be in your control, but mostly probably are not in your control all the time. And so instead, we're not really saying that it's, and I think we talked about this a lot in the first episode. It's like something that's so hard to communicate, that the managing stress piece isn't about always just controlling these stressors, but maybe understanding how these different triggers in life and these different things that come your way go into you, and then how that impacts your body on a deeper level. And so navigating both the actual impact on your body that you may not see or even really feel physically, or you might, but also the emotions that you feel. So there's almost two sides of that, which, would you agree that that's something that is not really communicated well, or maybe even well understood with how stress and overwhelm and all these things impact us?
Yeah, I absolutely would agree with that. And I think, again, something that I feel really passionate about, and that I think that I say almost at nauseum, is that I think part of a big contributing factor to that is because we are constantly moving, we are going, we are constantly receiving more and more information, whether that's through social media or TV or the news or email, like whatever it might be. And so I think we don't recognize subconsciously how much as a human you're being impacted right now. And so it's really easy to overlook some of the more subtle signals that your mind or your body might start to send you when you're starting to feel some of these things. And so, I think that there's just so much happening kind of in the background. And sometimes we don't notice it until it is like so big that it's disrupting your day, or physically impairing you or mentally impairing you to the point where it's like, oh, this is like now a significant thing that's getting in the way of me living my life.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that you mentioned that, of like, there's so much always going on, and that does have an actual impact. And you mentioned hormonally, there's hormones that are released with that, and there's actual processes happening in your body, whether you feel it, notice it, or even actively participate. So it's like not even just allowing it to happen, the fact that it is always happening. What are some of those subtle signs? Like what would be a signal, or some signals that you've seen people deal with or notice when they are maybe more intuitive and more in tune with some of those changes that are happening?
Sure. Yeah. So I think that everybody's body, I believe, communicates with them differently. So as I'm about to share some kind of like broad strokes for anybody listening or tuning in, this is not an end all be all like list. It doesn't mean that these have to be present, but some things that it might be helpful to start tuning into are things like your energy levels, right? Like that's one of the most obvious ones, starting to notice if your energy is dipping, or if you feel really energized at certain points throughout the day or things like that. That could be a great way. Checking in with your physical body. So doing an exercise like a body scan, if you start to notice maybe there's a certain area of your body that starts to feel really tense or tight when you're stressed or overwhelmed, or I'm going to guess that you see this often. Maybe if you experience like stomach pains, right? Or tightness in hip flexors or things like that, those can be common areas in the physical body that are kind of signaling to you to pay attention, or something's up, or it might be beneficial to explore that a little bit further. People can also start to experience tension headaches, or sometimes just starting to second guess everything that you're doing. It feels really difficult to make a decision, or sometimes even have a conversation with a partner or a loved one or a friend or a coworker, right? Like that might be a clue into like what's going on in my mind right now, and like all of the different ways that that can be impacted. So those are just to name a few, but those are some of the areas that I see people starting to notice, or just like chronic stress, just constantly waking up and feeling like I never can get enough done, or there's so much going on in a day, or the to-do list that for many of us is in reality just never ending, right? Like as soon as we take something off, we're adding something on. And so learning like when that starts to feel like I don't know how to handle this anymore, or I don't know how to do this, those can be really great signals to like explore a bit deeper and start paying attention.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think something that is interesting is that a lot of those things are perceived as normal, because it's very much part, especially in the US where we're based, it's part of our culture. It's part of the hustle, the grind, the working hard, the doing everything and getting everything out of your life, being present, just all of these things that we hear. And in some ways, I think it's celebrated. And so when we feel those things, it can be tempting to think that, well, that's supposed to happen. Or I think there's this other side of it where we feel like something's wrong with us. It's like almost more so blaming ourselves and blaming our bodies in some weird way about how, well, we can't keep up, like something must be wrong with me. And I see that a lot where it's like, well, I don't want to change any of these things. I don't want to look at what might be coming in, like something must be wrong with my body. And in some ways that might be true. I think there's, the varying capacities that we have based on how we process and what goes on and all of those different things. But I think what people don't understand is that there is something physical, like there's some physical things that are happening, and those are just signals. Why beyond cortisol? So we know cortisol is released when we're dealing with stress and, overwhelm and things like that. But what other parts of like the physical body, like what's actually happening beneath the surface that is causing some of like the lack of focus, the poor sleep, the poor energy, like all of those things to actually happen?
Yeah. So that lends me right into the nervous system, right? Because we're going to be thinking about, we have two parts of our nervous system. We have the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is when we are living from that fight, flight, or freeze mode that most of us are really, or many people are somewhat familiar with hearing about by now. And then we have the parasympathetic nervous system, which is more of the rest and digest mode that we all need to sustain our well-being over time. And what we hear about happening right now is that most of us are living in the activation of the sympathetic nervous system way more often than our bodies were made to, right? And so what happens when you live there is one of my favorite analogies for this that I learned in some of my graduate clinical work that I think is so helpful is thinking about the nervous system like the brake pedal and the gas pedal in a car. Are you familiar with this analogy? Do you use it?
I think that I've learned it from you
Oh.
before. So it's a great thing to remember and say over and over again.
Okay, well, hopefully it bears repeating, but I think it's so important because I think sometimes just like having knowledge tidbits like this is what really helps people start to recognize like there is nothing wrong with you for having these experiences, right? Like your body is responding in the way that it knows how to based on the demands that are being placed upon it. And so when we can kind of use information and knowledge to help alleviate some of the added self-judgment and self-criticism that whether you have some chronic illness going on, or whether this is more happening for you mentally and emotionally, hands down, judging yourself and being hard on yourself about it, not going to help. Right. And so that's why I repeat like knowledge and tidbits like this so often, because I think they're so important and they're not talked about enough. So jumping back a little bit, we spend so much time in this fight, flight, or freeze mode. And there are so many things that can activate that, whether that's a difficult conversation that you had, or something not going the way that you wanted it to go, maybe having a flare up and all of a sudden now you're reacting to being in like, oh no, what could this mean? What might happen next? And kind of like having that compounding stress or compounding anxiety on top of your real experience. And that's just keeping you in this go, go, go mode, which is activating. Then maybe your heart starts beating really quickly. Then your brain is moving really fast and you're thinking really about like every worst case scenario that could possibly come true, right? Like all of these things that we all experience internally very often. And then being able to, so that's like having the gas pedal down and having it full floor and not knowing how to stop or how to slow down. And then the brake pedal is when we learn to activate the parasympathetic nervous system that honestly reminds your body that you are safe, that things are, though they may not be ideal or how you want them to be, that you are not in life or death danger, which is how oftentimes your body is responding when you're in that sympathetic nervous system reaction. And so things like breath work, journaling, movement can be so helpful for activating that parasympathetic nervous system and actually learning how to strengthen your brake and know when to use it, because you get more in tune with your body and your mind.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. And I agree. I think learning what's actually happening in your body is so empowering because it takes away the judgment, the guilt, the opinions of others, the normalization of some of these things in our life, and brings it back to, what is my body saying? And I know that you agree. I think we probably even talked about this multiple times, but the communication from your body is something I always talk about. And it's, your body isn't communicating to you to fight you. Like your body's not communicating to you to shame you. The body's not communicating to you to harm you. Like the body's communicating, hey, I need something. And like, this is what's going on. Like we are trying to live, we're trying to function. We're trying to make it in our lives every day. And I'm trying to tell you, because you have the power to do some things to either help me, or we're going to keep going, as fast as possible. And we're probably going to go off the cliff because we can't stop if we go that fast. And so many times I think we just beat ourselves up for that communication our body's giving us instead of looking deeper. And it's so hard because sometimes that communication is not what we want to hear. And it might look like fatigue where you shut down. It may look like crying all afternoon, it may look like having a flare up. And those are really hard. And that looks different for every person. And that's difficult. And so I think it's so interesting to learn what's really going on beneath that communication. And when you know that, it's better, you're able to harness the communication a bit better, I think, and navigate it instead of feeling like you have to somehow turn off and on a switch or whatever it may look like, on a surface level. And then that comes down to, the actual practice of it, because it's easy to say, oh yeah, we need to learn how to slow down. We need to learn how to activate this, parasympathetic nervous system state and get into this mode. And that sounds really nice. And it almost sounds like the fancy switch. but it's not that easy.
Right.
And so
Nope.
I think I know where you will go with this. I'm just going to lead you there. Would you consider actual true self-care, what we call self-care, as being the practice of activating that nervous system state in coordination with your own body? Is that kind of?
Yeah. So, I think it depends on how one defines self-care, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that there are so many different ways that self-care is portrayed right now. And so I think that is hard to say like yes or no, because of that, right? So my response to that would be, well, how are we in our conversation going to define self-care? Because that's important.
So yeah, let's get into that. How would we actually define self-care? And I figured you would say that. So I want to start that conversation because recommending self-care is what we typically do. And so I think changing the conversation around what true self-care looks like, what true response to your body's communication looks like, is really important. So let's break it down. Yeah. What are the different versions of self-care that are out there, and what should self-care maybe actually be defined as?
Thinking about that, self-care is something that is so heavily utilized right now. And I can remember being in graduate school where I'm studying clinical mental health counseling, and still there was just like this blanket statement of like, make sure you're taking care of yourself. And I distinctly, vividly remember thinking like, what does that mean? And how do people do that? Like, what should I be doing? And I felt so confused and frustrated, even in a master's degree in clinical mental health counseling. So I now like to think about self-care as almost like the practice of learning to tune into, discern, and then take action on giving yourself what you genuinely need. The reason that I use those words when I use that definition is because it's important that we are being curious and reflective enough to get to know, like, when am I doing quote unquote self-care that maybe looks pretty, or that is like lazy, but isn't actually restorative? When am I when am I doing self-care that is forcing myself to look like what I've seen somebody else on the internet doing to take care of themselves, but actually does not feel good for me, right? Like, these are all of the nuances to self-care that's really important for that personal empowerment piece, so that every individual is no longer looking outside of themselves to define what they need, but actually starting to ask themselves more helpful questions to then, again, like, discern, do I really need to sit on the couch and watch Netflix today and chill out and zone out for a little while, because that's truly like what's going to be the most supportive for me, which is a-okay sometimes? Or would it actually feel more helpful for me today to go for a walk and schedule some doctor's appointments that I need to catch up on and take care of myself in that way? Or, like, there's so many different forms and practices of self-care. But I think that discernment and that reflection piece is the piece that often goes missing. And so people just say like, well, I took a bath last night and I don't feel better, so clearly self-care doesn't work, or it doesn't make a difference. And that's where I think it gets messy or sticky.
Yeah, I agree. And I think there's some inaccessibility or lack of accessibility when it comes to what's perceived as self-care too, where it's like, well, you have to be able to go get a massage, or you have to be able to afford, someone to help clean your house, or, it's like, it doesn't have to look that way. And not every time will it look that way. And that personal factor matters so much. And even the way that we ask for help, or the way that we do take action on the care that we need, sometimes it does look like things that aren't comfortable either. It's not always super comfy. It's not always even always relaxing. Sometimes it is simply doing what needs to be done, knowing that that's going to help, with relaxation tomorrow, or with, that support that you need later. And I love that conversation. And I think what can be kind of hard is that while it is empowering to know that self-care doesn't look the way we've been told it looks, and it is more personalized, and there can be a lot of power in it, I think it can also almost be overwhelming in and of itself, because there's so much responsibility and like personal ownership that's tied to self-care. Because if you're not actively discerning and listening and, processing and assessing yourself, it's very hard to do that. And that can sometimes feel like a lot. What would you say if that, I know that I felt that. And so I know someone listening, probably that's what's in their mind. And they're like, oh no, like that just seems like too much work. What would you say to that person? Or like, where would that actually start?
Yeah. And that's such a good point. And I certainly know many people that feel that way and have felt that way. So my first thought is to start small, right? So this, as you talk about the responsibility piece, and we talk about awareness and discernment and these like big buzzy type words, yes, it all sounds well and good. And it can also be overwhelming. And again, if we go back to that busyness factor, many people are going to have resistance because they're going to be like, I don't have time for that. Like, I'm too busy. I got too much going on. Maybe you have kids and you're working and life and like there's so much happening all of the time. So I totally relate to that. So my first thought would be start small. And even if you can find 5 minutes a day where you're just paying attention, starting to pay attention to how you're feeling physically, mentally, and emotionally. How are you talking to yourself? What's going on in your body? Like, and I'm a huge fan for writing things down. So if you could take 3 to 5 minutes and ask yourself 3 to 5 questions, like I just named really briefly right there, and just jot them down so that you're strengthening that muscle of what it feels like to pay attention to yourself. And just start there for maybe 2 weeks, maybe even a month. And then start to think about, maybe, can you look at those notes? Are you noticing any patterns? How might you envision that somebody can approach those things, right? And that might lead you to starting to find, like, what are the tools that you think could be helpful for some of the patterns that you're learning about yourself, right? So that might mean like, oh, it would actually feel really great to have 10 minutes to myself in the morning rather than jumping right into work, because I noticed that by X time, I feel like my stomach is in a twist, or I feel really overwhelmed, right? Or whatever it might be. You might start to gather more information that helps you be more in tune with what you'd like to try when it comes to some of these self-care practices, so that it doesn't feel like you're sitting down with a dictionary of options, feeling just overwhelmed. And you're like, I don't even know what word I'm looking up right now. You can kind of use more information before like pulling out the dictionary. And then you're going to have like, okay, right now I'm looking at D. And at least then you're focusing on one letter or one thing. And that's going to oftentimes feel much more palatable than trying to take this huge broad stroke of like, I'm going to start taking better care of myself. And it's like, okay, but what does that mean? And what does that look like for you?
Yeah, absolutely. It has to start with that connection. And I love that you brought that up, because that's something that I always communicate to clients. And, in my own life, I found to be so powerful is the act of journaling. And something that we talk about often within even our programs is, journaling, it's almost like creating just a safe space to communicate. So I always like to say that, like, starting without going into the deep conversations with yourself, but just learning how to like converse and communicate to yourself in a safe way, and like learning how to trust that it's okay for you to communicate. And journaling might be physically writing, it might be talking, I always say walk around your room and just have a conversation. It doesn't have to look one specific way. But that is always so fun to see that light up for people, because it is easy to just take what's on your brain, just write it down for a little bit, follow a prompt every day, like if you want to, just write and just talk and just see what happens whenever you learn that it's safe. One thing I think I see some people that do run into, though, because of maybe their nervous system is just very off and something's going on there because there has been just that chronic stress, and they are in that fight, flight, or freeze to a level that almost feels impossible to get out of. Or maybe there's like past trauma that comes up and that blocks parts of their brain, if you will, or, or these emotions, or maybe what they're going through is so challenging that even the act of trying to write it down or think about it causes their body to respond, because it's a lot to process, which is probably a lot of even our community. What would you say for that? Because that may cause a block. And so what's one of the best ways to get through that if you're kind of feeling like you're in that state?
Yeah. So I think that is so real and so important. And honestly, my biggest thought on that would be to start working with a professional, to start working with a therapist, and to find somebody to walk that path with you, because it can feel really hard to try and do that on your own without an expert, without somebody who's trained, without somebody who is able to hold that difficulty with you and just give you space and time and a framework and insight to utilize as you process through that, as you learn to navigate it, as you learn to work with it in different ways, learn what other options you might have. I think it's just so important to work with a professional if you're experiencing that.
Yeah, absolutely. And then even thinking about the tools that you talked about earlier, of like how to actually give, like if you identify the need, it's like, well, I noticed my need. I have no idea what it looks like to give myself that, like rest. Yeah. How do I give myself rest when I have, 3 kids and I have a full-time job? It's like, there are these situations where it does feel like, well, there's no obvious answer here. I don't have that equipment just because I've never been taught that or told that, or it doesn't look like what it looked like for Chelsea online, or for Aaron online, or for this other person online. A really great professional is going to be there to help give tools too, and ideas, and help you understand that. And I think what's fun is knowing that you have the ability to try things. And I think that's something too, where sometimes there is this mindset of, well, that didn't work. Like you mentioned with the bath, like, well, I took a bath and it didn't work, so it doesn't work for me. And I hear that with journaling, where it's like, that just doesn't work. Meditation, it just doesn't work for me. And totally. I know that's kind of a closed mindset to believe that, like, well, that's the only way that should look. But I think there's something around that people haven't been told. So let's explore that. Like, what does it look like to maybe trial and have fun and give yourself permission to, like, for things to work or not work? Or is there a type of mindset that you work with clients on ever around that?
Totally. Yeah. So thinking about that, I think 2 of the biggest pillars that I stand on as a coach is having a growth and experimental mindset. So thinking about a growth mindset, right? Like that is holding the belief that we can change, that we can shift our ability, learn something new, grow in how we approach something, right? Versus a closed or a fixed mindset, which is almost the belief of like, this is just who I am and that's never going to change. That can be really difficult to navigate. And also based on science, we know that that's untrue, right? Like we know that our brains have plasticity. They can change no matter what age you are. It might look different. It might take different lengths of time or different number of practices in order to make some of these changes, but we have neuroplasticity in our brain. It is possible to change. And so reminding yourself of that and really embodying this growth mindset and kind of taking on the initiative of being like a lifelong student, a lifelong learner of yourself, of the world. Like we're all constantly doing that, whether or not we're actively participating in it or not. So having a growth mindset is hugely helpful. And then also I think about an experimental mindset alongside of that. So obviously we live, especially here in the US, in a culture that is very driven by success and outward like productivity and like this onwards and upwards only trajectory, which has benefits to it. And having dreams and desires and goals and working to improve, like those are all great things. And we have to recognize that we're all human here. Nobody is always moving onwards and upwards. Nobody is constantly productive. Nobody is only ever successful. And actually, the better that we can get at failing, the more fully we'll experience life, and the more that we'll be able to give the self permission to experiment with new things, to try something different, to approach something again after it didn't go well a time or two or 10 or 20, right? And so that helps you actually develop resiliency. That helps you develop self-trust and self-efficacy, right? And these are vital aspects that are going to contribute to your well-being overall. So it's a big unlearning about what it means to grow, to experiment, to try something new, and really appreciating that there is also value in the times where it doesn't go well, or in the times where something doesn't work for you, right? Like that's still helpful information. Like I might learn that I'm somebody who hates taking baths, but I actually love getting in a sauna or doing a cold shower, or cooking feels like therapeutic for me, or whatever it might be. And so if I didn't allow myself to experiment, how would I ever learn those things about myself?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that goes back to what we mentioned of the start is knowing how to connect to yourself, and in a not necessarily positive or even healthy way, but just in a way, like knowing how to just be with yourself and understand what you're saying. Because the power is, well, my body's communicating something different. And I think it's important to remember that if it does feel like, well, nothing ever works for me, and like, well, that is my experience. It's like, okay, let's dig deeper into your connection to yourself and what is your body saying? Like, you're not wrong, but there might be something else there that is being communicated that we could dig into. And I think what's also helpful to say is, because I teach growth and fixed mindset as well when it comes to IBS and health and any change you make in your life, it's like you have to have that growth mindset, because not everything's going to work specifically for your body at all times. And like we mentioned before with the nervous system and just how your body functions, your body's not always going to have the capacity to do everything well every day. And you're going to hit roadblocks. That's just how it works. And those dealing with chronic illness, those roadblocks might come up more often. And so there's a lot to that. I think one of the hesitations I've seen around this is this idea that a growth mindset has to also be this kind of can-do attitude of like, well, I'm always positive and it's okay, I'm ready to pick it back up. And it's like, it's not like that. I think the truth of it is, it's not always pretty. Like you might fall apart first and you might throw a fit, you might be angry, and that's okay to be frustrated. It's okay to be sad. And I think disappointment is something that we always have to talk about, because it's like, it's okay to be disappointed when you really try something and it doesn't work for you. Because that just is part of it. And I think the growth part isn't about, well, I'm going to be happy and like, it'll all work out in the end. Like, it's more about, you know what, like that actually didn't work and that was hard. I think it's being present with that too. Would you agree?
Absolutely. Yes, I would agree. And I think too, I love that you just focus on that disappointment piece, because I think that is something that just naturally as human beings, we try to avoid as much as possible. I mean, it sucks to be disappointed, whether it is in something outside of us, whether it's in ourselves, whether it is in like a hope or an idea that we had of how something was going to go or how it was going to work for us. Like that, I find and I see with my clients, avoiding disappointment is something that is so innate and also oftentimes subconscious. Like we don't recognize that we're doing it a lot of the time when we're doing it. And so bringing that to light and knowing like, yeah, no, it's having a growth mindset doesn't mean being positive 24/7. It doesn't mean that you're going to put a silver lining on everything, because a lot of times that's actually not helpful, right? And we need to be able, no matter what, to sit with the full range of our human emotions. And sometimes that's going to look like having the best day ever and feeling like, oh my gosh, things feel so great right now. Like I'm so excited. And that also means having those days where you are crying or you are like hugely disappointed about something in your life or in your body or whatever it might be. And then everywhere in between, right? So making space and permission to and normalizing that that's part of being human. That's part of all of our experience here. Nobody gets through life without having that and without doing that. And so the more that one can practice, like reminding ourselves of that, especially if you're somebody who has perfectionistic tendencies, or maybe you're really uncomfortable with some of those harder emotions right now, or maybe right now your life looks like more difficulties and struggles and hard parts than good parts. It might be really challenging to accept that this is a reality of life. But oftentimes we need to feel it to heal it, right? We need to be present, like you mentioned, with these things and start to, I mean, it's part of the process of getting to know yourself better, whether that's on a physical or a mental and emotional level. And I think too, like the theme of self-acceptance is coming up for me as we're talking, not acceptance in a way of like, it is what it is, and I just have to like be okay with it. But as an example, and I've shared this on the last podcast, again, I'll share it again. Like I have IBS, I have GERD, I've struggled with these since I was a kid. And there was a time when I was in like my early 20s, I was studying psychology, and I was just like so much in a season of trying to figure myself out and trying to like find kind of what we're talking about. Like, what are the things that help me feel my best, that help me manage my life in ways that feel good for me and work for me. And I often found myself really frustrated because I felt like I couldn't, quote unquote, do as much as other people would do and feel okay or feel good or feel how I wanted to feel. Or I found that I actually needed a lot more structured rest time than I saw other people around me needing. And eventually I came to learn like, oh, a traditional 9 to 5 job for me does not work for me. Doesn't work for my body, doesn't work for my mind, doesn't work for how I want to live my life. Like, and all of those pieces at points were so hard for me to accept because, like you mentioned before, I created this narrative of like, what is wrong with me? Why can't I do everything that is quote unquote normal that I see other people doing? And actually, when I moved into this avenue where I was like, no, I just actually get to listen to my body when I start to feel more fatigued and more tired. And I'm going to opt to do something more restorative rather than going out. And I'm going to start to embrace that. And that took years. I'm not saying that this was like a switch type of experience, but it was really hard to accept that. And at first I felt wildly disappointed. And I had to go through all of these series of emotions, of getting to know my body, right? Like learning all of these things at work. But without allowing that process, I don't know what my life would look like right now. And so though it was painful and hard, staying in this curious growth, experimental mindset has really helped. And I'm using myself as an example, but I've also seen this in many, many, many clients get to this place of like, oh, I feel way more aware of who I am and things that support me and what works for my body and my mind and what doesn't. And it, again, it's like this ongoing journey.
Yeah.
As cheesy as that sounds.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard not to be cheesy with it because sometimes the truth is kind of cheesy. And I think it's good to have conversations on a deeper and also practical level about it, because I see it too. And as someone who, as a health professional, even the things that we're taught for helping people get through things, it is always like onwards and upwards. And sometimes we just forget to like say, like, you know what, it's not fair. And like, that's okay that it doesn't feel fair. And it's okay that you feel frustrated. And if you ignore those feelings and those thoughts, like that's not actual communication. And I see that often where I see, my clients, and I do it because I want to avoid discomfort. I want to just think about the good and the movement. And it takes time. And I've had even clients tell me, I can't journal in the morning because my whole day is going to be spent like crying and thinking about these things, because sometimes that's what it is. And I think what we have to remember is that the process of building awareness is not meant to always just feel good. It's like meant to really get to know you. And that includes the happy and the joy and the gratitude and the excitement, which can come the exact same day as the disappointment, the frustration, the anger, all the different emotions that can come up, and ignoring them or putting them aside, or even hyper focusing on the emotion without having the conversation, which I think is sometimes this weird avoidance of like, I'm going to focus so much on the emotion and I'm angry, but I'm never going to talk about it. Like that can happen too, as well as I'm happy and I'm just going to ignore the fact that I feel angry right now and like everything's fine. And then you fall apart later. It's all about getting to know you, communicating, and the acceptance is accepting that that's part of you and working through that in whatever way it looks like for you. And it's just so important. And I think even getting resources on, like, I remember whenever I started having this conversation as myself, my personality, I grew up in a family who didn't talk about feelings or emotions. I can compartmentalize. I've got that skill, if you will, where I can definitely compartmentalize for short periods of time. And that means I can shut off, emotions that don't serve me in the moment. So if I need to be working with a client and I'm extremely sad, I can shut it off. It's going to come back. And I do have to say hello to it again, because it can only get stuffed for so long. But it took a long time in my own life to realize that like emotions were like, there were more emotions than I thought. And some of the signals I was hearing from my body were actual emotions with a name and with like potential triggers and reasons for them. And they were signals of things that I would have never thought. I would think like, disappointment and those different things, like the feelings, just, I don't know that, I don't know how to even describe that, but not understanding what emotions are. And I think I learned that well into my 20s, like even just in the past 5 years as an adult, and just hearing conversations about it. And I think that's something, this is not a self-help podcast. And the season of our podcast is all about just conversations. Like, I don't want there to be, here are your 5 action steps, with every episode. I want it to spark just thought and insight and, maybe a different perspective. But one challenge I think I would give a lot of people is learning what emotions are. And that might be with a therapist. It might be with a coach. It might be from a book or from a podcast or something, but just learning what the actual names of certain emotions are and what they feel like and what they look like. And then exploring that in your body with that communication that, okay, anger might look this way. What does that look like for me? And then what is this that I'm feeling? Is that actually anger, or is that shame? Is that sadness? What is that actually? And that's been really empowering with building that safe communication through journaling, and through my therapist is incredibly helpful with giving me insight into things that's like, well, I keep trying this and I'm going in circles. And it's like, well, what if you looked at it in a different perspective? And that's been empowering. But then just learning, okay, I'm hearing these things from myself. Now I can put a name to it and communicate it and make sense of it and explore it. And to me, it feels, I feel more human because now I have this range of emotions that I feel. It's not just I have a good day or bad day. It's like, no, I'm feeling all these different things. And that's a little bit of a segue, but I thought about that too with self-acceptance. I think coming back to even what we talked about with the nervous system, and, you have to understand that to know what your body's saying, and even parts of self-care might be part of that. And I think it's also important to have the knowledge and the power of what emotions are and what those really look like and how to talk about them. And, you might only talk to yourself about it. You don't always have to tell everyone what you're feeling at all times of the day. You don't even have to express it at all times of the day. But I think just that's a big empowerment tool that a lot of us are missing.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that thought. And I see that often, right? Where oftentimes we'll kind of pick like, I don't know, a handful of emotions that are go-to like ways of describing ourselves or ways of responding when somebody asks, how are you? Or, and we can get sometimes hyper fixated on that or not know, like, what does that actually mean? Like every time I tell somebody I'm anxious or I tell myself I'm anxious, like, what am I actually telling myself? What does that actually feel like for me? Is that actually true right now? What other words might fit here? And I think too, another empowering piece around emotional intelligence, which is kind of what we're talking about, is recognizing the duality and the nuance of emotion so that we as human beings, we have the capacity to feel multiple emotions at the same time. And I often see that feel really confusing for people. Like, how can I both be so excited and so sad at the same time? How can I feel really connected and also alone at the same time, right? Like, and I think normalizing that experience too is so important here, because sometimes it doesn't fit into a neat little box of being able to say like this emotion, that emotion, right? And so welcoming that and knowing that it's okay to feel multiple things at the same time, and you can make space for all of them as a practice as well. And I think what you mentioned too, of just getting in the habit of naming and exploring, like, what are the emotions? What does come up for you? What is present right now is hugely powerful.
Yeah. And going even back to the very start, like it takes away, I think, some of the overwhelm, like it takes away some of the stress in a weird way. And I don't know if there's any, research around that of like emotional intelligence and helping decrease stress or something. But in myself, I noticed that of being able to, I guess the acceptance piece maybe is that tie of like just being able to accept the fact that like, you know what, I'm grateful for things and I'm sad and I'm, excited and happy and I'm frustrated. And, as I've dealt with my own gut issues and I've walked with clients through it, like there's so much power in that too, as you're making changes and as you're dealing with chronic illness and all these things that, yes, it's unfair. Yes, there's some bad days and there's some feelings that go along with that. There are also moments of gratitude. There are also moments of joy. And sometimes I think we have to either cover up the negative or I guess negatives. I'm trying to get away from using the word negative because I think that also has its own power of like, well, if I feel that something's wrong with me. So that's always checking our words, which is important. But those things that maybe people don't like to see, I think a lot of times we either want to cover that up and just show oh, well, I am alive. And so I guess I must be grateful. For those with IBS, it's, well, I don't have IBD. So I guess I should be grateful because that's what my doctor told me, instead of embracing both. Or I think sometimes we want to hide the good emotion. I don't know another word for that. The emotions that maybe are prettier or sexier or, more accepted, like happiness and joy and gratitude and all of those different feelings. We want to hide those because we want people to know how mad we are or how sad we are and how horrible the day is. And I think, the toxic positivity conversation, which we're not going to get into, is just cutting out the quote unquote negative. We need a better word for that. And just slapping on well, think positively, have positive thoughts. But I think there's also some power in realizing that if we only focus on one, we're not serving our bodies, we're not serving ourselves, we're not serving our relationships. And whether you're portraying just the high or whether you're portraying just the low, like you've taken away a whole aspect of who you are, and you're probably going to feel empty, at the end of the day. And you're probably also going to be stuck at the end of the day. And like self-care is not going to make sense, because how do you take care of yourself if you don't have all the information you need? And, I think there's just so much to it that's beyond just thinking positively or, just even saying like, oh, you can hold space for both. I think there's so much there, and just scratching the surface of understanding it and being okay with it. And then leading to acceptance is like level 1, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And just one more quick note on that. One of my favorite quotes by the Queen, Brene Brown, is that, and she found this through her research, is that as human beings, we can't selectively numb. So when we numb out the more challenging emotions, then we typically are also muting out some of our ability to feel really good. And I see that play out to be true with my clients all the time, right? We're almost like, it almost shrinks your emotional bandwidth. Like you only let yourself feel a little bit this way or a little bit that way. And what happens when, first of all, that doesn't feel good for your body. Second of all, you're definitely storing a ton of emotions if you're doing that. And then thirdly, more from like kind of like a spiritual-ish perspective, is like you're missing out on a lot of your experience of life when you like shrink your ability to feel. And so as hard as it might be and as uncomfortable as it might feel, if you can remind yourself often that like this is part of the human experience, is being able to feel like this whole rainbow of emotions, that's part of like living a full life, and normalize that and practice normalizing that and saying that to yourself over and over and over again, it can be helpful to change the perspective on how you feel about having certain emotions, whether they're good or bad.
Yeah, I love that. That's so good. And I think just that final truth that it might not always be easy to do that, because sometimes those emotions that have been numbed are going to be very strong and not easy to navigate. And so there is zero shame in getting help and, finding safe spaces to like allow yourself to feel and explore and process is so, so important. And it's okay to be selective with that too. I think that's something that we have to give ourselves permission for, is, find the safe space. And if it's not with yourself yet, like find a third party, like find help. And then if people in your life are also not safe for that, like don't do that. It's not a safe space. And if you don't feel safe, there's a reason. And so, really being selective and knowing that when you find that safety, like you're able to process those things and maybe even get in the middle, because you might go to the other end of that bandwidth. I know I experienced that some whenever I was learning my emotions, and it wasn't even that there was anything like so significant or profound that was there. It's just I didn't feel and actively, engage with so many emotions. And so when they started coming, it felt like I was constantly on a pendulum, and I needed some support to get in the middle and learn how to just be present with those, because they weren't something I was engaging with. And so I just want to encourage anyone that it's okay to get help. And that might look like a therapist. It might look like a coach. It might, look like a spiritual guidance person. Like it may look different. And so that's just part of the exploration, and ask questions and trust your intuition in some ways, to make sure that you feel good. And that'll help you move forward.
Love that. So important.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Chelsea, this is a great conversation. My mind is like going. So I think anyone listening, it's a great time to like grab a notebook and like just write thoughts, maybe listen again and see what pops out. Because it's always just it's fun to talk about these nuances of us and being human and having life and, what that looks like. And so I can't wait to dive deeper in my own thoughts from this.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate your time and sharing all of your expertise.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I loved this conversation as always.
Me too, Chelsea.